Yume Nikki is one of the most important indie horror games of all time. This much is obvious just from looking at the sheer breadth of its influence. It wasn't the first game to use RPG Maker for a purpose other than making a dedicated RPG, but Quartz Party was a lot messier and much less committed to the premise. It's obvious why Yume Nikki, being a much more consistent and overall stronger package, garnered more attention for it. Likewise, it wasn't the first surrealist, dream-centric, aimless exploration game, but unlike LSD Dream Emulator, it wasn't an obscure PlayStation exclusive, but rather a free, low-spec computer game, making it much more accessible. That's another thing. It didn't get its popularity from being tied to some big brand, or being an entry in some big-name series. Even its creator, Kikiyama, is a mysterious and reclusive person who certainly wasn't engaged in guerrilla marketing to get this game out there. This was the oldest game I can think of that gained its popularity primarily from internet discussion, gaining notoriety on Niche Channel and an even larger fan base with an English-speaking audience later on. It didn't just go down a path to success, it paved pathways for many more games in the future to walk down. You could say it hardly needs any introduction, so I won't drag it out any further. The intro to Yume Nikki is shockingly well made, especially for an RPG Maker project from 2004. Before you've even gotten into the gameplay loop proper, Yume Nikki makes clear two of its primary appeals: technical craftsmanship and attention to detail. Walk down outside and you'll see an empty balcony with a background texture on a different layer, giving it a sense of perspective. A mildly impressive attribute that becomes one of the centerpieces of the game's visual design. Despite the game instructing the player to go to bed, it's practically human instinct to try and go through the door first. However, walk up to it and Monotsuki just shakes her head. It's a bit of quick, silent characterization that invites the player to think about the situation. Why won't you go outside? Selecting the chair puts a black cover over most of the screen and plays a music box song, breaking the previous silence with something tonally appropriate. This is where you can save your game in the titular Dream Diary. That the game is named after one of its most important yet mundane basic functions comes across as deliberately conveying simplicity. But my favorite part of this opening section is that you can play a minigame called Nasu on the Famtendo. As all real gamers know, this is a reference to the Ekasu Boxu. Nasu is basically just a real arcade game, perfectly functional in design and even a little fun in short bursts. It's no Pac-Man or Tetris, but we can't all be the best. This is something that has nothing to do with the rest of the game. It's such an unnecessary detail, and I'm sure that designing and coding this into RPG Maker in 2004 would have been a hassle. But this serves a purpose alongside everything else, conveying the game's whole idea. Again, technical craftsmanship and attention to detail. Of course, this all happens before you're thrown into the real meat of the gameplay. Hop into bed and Monotsuki will dream herself into an alternate version of her bedroom on the balcony. There's something uncanny about how similar but obviously different it is. This time, if you walk out the door, you'll end up in a nexus of multiple other doors. Each door contains its own bizarre, unearthly location, every one different from the last. The visual variety and splendor on display here is almost impossible to communicate with words, and many of them contain other doors, other paths to go down. This is basically the whole game, this space of dreams for you to traverse. In a word, Yume Nikki is about exploration. And because it's probably the most exemplary game of its kind that I can think of, I'd like to go into more detail about what exactly I mean by that. I tend to avoid the use of genre titles where summarizing their mechanics would be clearer. For that reason, I avoid the nebulous adventure game label to instead say it's a game about exploration. I reserve this title for games where navigating the space itself is a major aspect of gameplay. It's not simply an obstacle course for real gameplay or some other means to an end. A lot of games incorporate exploration as a mechanic, many with quite a high profile. The Legend of Zelda series is one where navigating dungeons is an important skill. The Metroid series encourages both speedrunners and completionists alike by rewarding them for memorizing a space with progress and collectibles. And I think any RPG with a large world would fit for this example, but let's say the Mother series features towns filled with useful consumables or fun optional content, greatly contributing to the tone of the game. In those cases though, exploration shares its time alongside combat, puzzles, and narrative. Not so with Yume Nikki. This is a game almost entirely about exploration. In those other games, your exploration is rewarded by some mechanical benefit that is somewhat disconnected from the task of exploration. The common thread would be items that help in combat or traversal or strategy or narrative. But in Yume Nikki, it's all about exploration all the time. As such, none of its rewards give any mechanical advantage that isn't directly related to exploration. So, Yume Nikki has two types of rewards. The first would be just interesting locations, events, or situations. Probably the most well-known example of this is the Uboa event. You can find the start of this after traveling through the snow world and moving to find the Pink Sea, then traveling to a solitary house, wherein you can find an NPC named Poniko. A special song plays here, and if you turn the lights off, the colors in the song both change. And There's a slight chance, which can be reset by waiting or re-entering the house, that turning off the lights will turn Poniko into Uboa. This will scare the piss out of you, even if you're expecting it. Interacting with Uboa teleports you to an area where you can only move in a loop, left and right, very slowly, and from here you must restart. Despite how difficult this would be to find and trigger, there's no benefit to this. It's arguably a punishment, a little bit. All you get is whatever joy you can derive from the experience itself. Such is the case for most of the content in Yume Nikki. It's to be enjoyed for its own sake, not for the mechanics. Events like this exist all over the game, basically. Yubo isn't the only one, it's just the only one I'm going to talk about. The second reward would be the effects. Sometimes these have little to no practical uses, only providing a bit of visual variety. But the ones that have utility are only useful in as much as they benefit exploration. The bicycle effect allows Marotsuki to move much faster, for example, making exploration easier to do at a brisker pace. And the iconic knife effect allows her to make enemies disappear, often allowing her to pass through areas she couldn't, but sometimes giving other unique scenarios, or rewards that, again, aid in exploration. Further reinforcing this is that there is no game over in Yume Nikki. The closest thing to a failstate is when you're trapped in an area and can't leave, so you're forced to pinch yourself awake to start the dream over again. This is really interesting considering how failure is contextualized in other games as a death that didn't really happen. But failure in Yume Nikki is not only canon, resetting is diegetic. Because exploration is the point of the game, the punishment is being trapped in an area that no longer allows you to explore further and having to then restart exploration from the beginning. It all reinforces itself. If being so steadfastly committed to a single genre wasn't odd enough, the choice of exploration in particular comes across as especially peculiar. From my experience, anecdotally, there seems to be a prevalent attitude that the act of exploration in a game is not a legitimate form of gameplay. Some people throw in the term walking simulator as a pejorative, but I think Yume Nikki's design lends itself just as well to an interesting experience. As in any other game with a focus on exploration, you benefit from memorization and visualization of spaces, from intuiting the meaning and direction of level design. It's not the same as a test of reflexes, but if puzzles and strategy are genres of game, then surely navigation should also qualify as well, for its potential to be just as much of a mental test. I think it could be said that even the game's ending, its ultimate goal, seems to reinforce the idea that exploration is the most important aspect, and that it doesn't really provide much. For those who don't know, well, maybe skip ahead 40 seconds, but if you gather all the effects in the Nexus, a stepping stool appears in the real world, and Marotsuki uses it to jump off and kill herself. The credits show strange creatures gathering around a bloodstain, and that's it. I feel like this is, in a way, attempting to subvert the idea of narrative being a reward for exploration. There is no explanation given, and it's an outcome that seems particularly negative. It's almost like a punishment, and if that's true, then it's putting itself on a lower pedestal than the exploration itself, saying that the exploration was the most important, fun, fulfilling part of the experience, not any outside reward. At least that's what I think the point was. Perhaps even more impressive, though, is how the mechanical construction of the game and also the presentation ties into the game's subject matter. So, Yume Nikki simply is about dreams, right? It's trying to emulate the experience of dreaming. To fit with that, its visuals and sounds are bizarre, mixed concepts falling together without logical order. In a word, surreal. It's trying to elicit something relating to the unconscious mind, the same way dreams do. Its gameplay is aimless exploration, wandering around, seeing things, interacting in weird ways, no more purpose or system to it, which, again, fits with how we interact with dreams. They're aimless, they're without systems. It all feeds back into itself to become a holistic work of art about dreaming. And that's really what makes Yume Nikki so great. There's little I can find to criticize, and little that a hater could criticize that doesn't feed into its intentions. Comments like, it lacks an objective, or it's not particularly complex, can be counted by, that's the point. It's a dream, after all. So I would say that Yume Nikki is a nearly perfect execution of its core concept. However, perhaps there's more to be said about that. For example, what exactly is all this trying to achieve? What's the message? What's the point, so to speak? It's a funny thing, because most modern discussions of Yume Nikki are set on trying to explain all the little details, of providing people their own interpretations of the work. Although the story has almost no text outside of tutorials and menus, there's a lot going on visually that seems to imply a state of the world, or a state of the main character. I've seen theories ranging from Marotsuki is a hikikomori with anxiety, to Marotsuki was pregnant and something about that went wrong, to Marotsuki is transgender. However, I'm not here to speculate on which idea I think is correct. Rather, I'll start by saying something which I know is correct. A statement on Kikiyama's website introducing the game can be translated as, Yume Nikki has no story or message, it's just a walking simulator. Now, if you can hold any incredulous reactions, I think that instead of this being a statement that all theories are inherently wrong, that Yume Nikki is inherently simple and meaningless, this is an indirect declaration that Kikiyama refuses to clarify anything about the game. Yume Nikki is an example of what I'll call non-explanatory art, which is to say, neither the work itself nor anything produced by the owner or author makes clear what it's about, so to speak. Most art either has an author who's willing to speak on their intentions, or is direct enough that it doesn't need that to be understood. Anything to which neither applies is non-explanatory. I hope the explanation of non-explanatory art was adequately explanatory. So, what does that mean? Can a game like Yume Nikki be about anything? Well, from the way I see it, there's two ways to look at non-explanatory art. Either it's about the artist, or it's about the audience. If we say that an artist puts a lot of themselves into the art they create, then you could see a non-explanatory work that isn't explicitly about them as an abstract, mosaic representation of their inner thoughts, their ideas and interests at the time. I think Yume Nikki provides a few interesting examples of that, despite its scarce story. It makes quite a few references to Nihon folklore, or other specific cultural touchstones that would be more familiar to someone like Kikiyama, who, lives there, speaks the language, all that. There's a whole area dedicated to Famicom visuals, and more specifically the Mother or Earthbound series, games that obviously Kikiyama played and thinks about a lot. I'm sure you could apply the same logic to everything in the game, even if it's just something like Kikiyama thought this would look cool. And sure, that thought experiment can be fun. However, I think the issue with that, aside from trying to reduce a complex person down to something as simple as a theme without being self-referential, is that, well, it doesn't seem like Kikiyama wants the game to be analyzed in this way. Kikiyama is famous for basically being unknown, barely making public statements about anything, not elaborating on themselves or their game. I think it's unusual for someone to reject recognition so thoroughly without reason, and Kikiyama's actions certainly go beyond ambivalence into plain rejection. If we assume Kikiyama has a reason, the best guess I could give is that they're worried about what it would do for Yume Nikki as a work of art. That's what I think anyway. So let's take that other option, which I think is the actual intention. It's a common perspective that non-explanatory art is meant to be a projective test, like a Rorschach test. Whatever you take away from it says something about your personality, functioning, memories, and perhaps you can learn something from that. And I imagine that's the idea behind Yume Nikki. That's why there's so much evocative imagery in Madatsuki's dreams. Perhaps that's why the whole game is about dreams. In the same way we might interpret dreams as having meaning, we can interpret this game as having an overall theme. But in both cases, we can never know our interpretations to be true for sure. It's simply something beyond our current understanding. As far as we know, dreams could basically be random, and Yume Nikki could have been constructed on a whim. But what's more important than that is what we take away from it. In a sense, while no individual theory about Yume Nikki can truly be the point, the existence of theories is. It means those people got something out of the game. Cool. But this is where I have to admit, I think there's a flaw in pursuing this concept, something about it that makes this decision for storytelling simply not my favorite. I do enjoy the feeling of being confused by a story, the experience of not knowing everything, but I also like unraveling that confusion, coming across a satisfying answer at some point. If the answer remains hidden, or if it's not meant to exist, then I'll be lacking that satisfaction, unless I come up with something on my own and force myself to believe it, which, well, it's not something I typically do. I also find that, although creating a derivative work such as a theory, fanfiction, or hell, even this critique can be enjoyable, it definitely gives a good starting point, but I don't find it as fulfilling as creating my own art, writing my own stories, and drawing my own characters. But that's just my personal preference, and I'm not a normal person, which is to say, I can see why something like this is valuable for others, but I just don't feel it as much for myself. Furthermore, part of me feels there's something easy about an ambiguous, incomplete narrative. Let's say we can divide most stories into two parts. 1, the setup, the premise, the interesting question being asked. 2, the payoff, the conclusion, the satisfying answer being given. In this regard, I would say it takes some level of talent to raise an interesting question and come up with a satisfying answer. And also, the answer reached may be something very personal reached by the creator, and it may be abrasive to different people. People might dislike where it ended up. I like art to have these qualities. I think it shows effort, personality, courage to do these kinds of things. If I connect with the answer more, I may feel I have a more personal relationship with the work. I also think it's easier to come up with a premise than it is to come up with a payoff. It's the difference between shooting the shit and following through that makes me appreciate it more. However, doing the opposite isn't necessarily difficult. Come up with a question that doesn't have an answer, create setups without payoff, start a premise that lacks that conclusion. If you boil it down to that, it's about not doing something. Maybe there's something about making an otherwise good work with this in mind that makes it difficult, but I've yet to discover what that is, so I can't possibly convey it. Moreover, it lacks that abrasive factor. If there is no answer, if the answer is entirely up to the player, then there just gonna come up with whatever satisfies them. In a literal sense, it's whatever they want it to be. You could even argue that I, in saying there is no answer, have made that my answer, because it satisfies me in some way. So there's no avoiding it. All in all, it just feels, easy. But I can admit that's also a reductive way to look at things. A story is more than just the question and the answer. Games too are more than just the goalposts, they're the whole journey there. Which is to say, the execution of something is more important than the premise or the payoff. And as I've already gone over, it's difficult to deny that Yume Nikki isn't an interesting experience, one clearly made with a lot of thought and effort. If anything, it's more difficult to properly criticize its execution than it is to simply enjoy it as it is. Perhaps I could give harsher criticism to this aspect if I felt it didn't stand up on its own without it, but it certainly does. While it might owe some of its popularity to the simple device of ambiguity, its quality isn't reliant upon that. Yume Nikki could have a meaning, it could have one that really sucks, and it would still give interesting spaces to explore, fun secrets to find, and a masterclass in surrealist presentation and mechanics that all intertwine perfectly. Which is why, even though the ambiguity of Yume Nikki doesn't quite align with my preferences, I still really respect it quite a lot. And you might love it even more than me, if you're the type who gets more of ambiguous stories than I do. I already considered it a must-play game before I made this video, and the process only reaffirmed that to me. So do yourself a favor if you haven't already, but be sure to take it in moderation, and try to play it at 3 AM. That's all I have.